original IPA, what could it have been like? It was originally brewed over 150 years ago. Now, beer historian and author Ron Pattinson is going to explain to us how it's been quite different at various times, shaped completely by greed and war. Now, while we always think of this as a heavily hoppy, really strong beer, stick around and learn exactly when that wasn't true, but more importantly, why.
I'm going to be telling you now about the history of IPA, which may not be exactly what everyone thinks it was. But one of the things that I call it the beer empire, and that's the thing to realize. It's a beer which is inherently linked to the British Empire. Without the British Empire, it wouldn't have existed. And it's a very imperial sort of thing. IPA is something which has been loads of different things in Britain over the years, and trying to come up with one specific definition of IPA, of British IPA, is actually completely impossible, because the term IPA has been used for very different beers over a very long period of time with loads of different characteristics. So to say, oh, there's one thing which was English IPA is basically impossible. But that's true of every single beer style in the world, I would say. So you shouldn't really get too hung up about that. Original IPA, what was it like? I've heard loads of different theories about what it was. People who are saying it, lots of different things, but I don't believe a lot of them. And you can see that over time it changed a lot, IPA. It was lots of different things at various different times. At some points it was a couple of different things at the same time. So for the modern idea, thinking, oh, IPA is some strong beer that's really heavily hopped, that doesn't necessarily apply to the whole history of IPA. And I'm going to demonstrate some of this with different recipes and lots and lots of numbers. When I was preparing for this talk, I started looking through the newspaper archive for references to pale in India. And I got a whole load of ones from the 1780s and onwards. And none of them said India Pale Ale, and you really know much of what the beer was like. One of the things I can say, there were only 3 beers that seemed to be imported into India. They were Pale Ale, Porter, and surprisingly small beer. So really weak beer. The idea that it comes from October beer, I really don't get that. People might have got confused, because what you find is in the 19th century especially, people are always going to about their pale ales that they were brewed in October, but this was because they were stock ales. October was the best time to brew them, and anything you wanted to be a stock beer, you would probably brew it either in October or March, but preferably October. So just saying that a pale ale was brewed in October doesn't make it an October beer. And so the most likely thing is, when you see how they described the original pale ales, it was pale ale as prepared for India. That's the term that comes before India Pale Ale. And so what that says to me is, well, it was probably just a standard London Pale Ale, which had been prepared for export to the Far East, which meant they would have hopped the bugger like hell. And so it has nothing to do with it being an October beer. Just saying it was brewed in October just means you're brewing it as a stock beer. And my guess is it was just, and because the original breweries like Hodgson, who brewed the Pale Ale for India, but in London, it would have just been their standard Pale Ale, which would have been, if it was a common ale, a beer of around probably about 1070 or something like that they just hopped up like hell so they could send it to India and it wouldn't go off. And that would be my guess about the origins of India Pale Ale. And when you look at the later beers, that looks right, because you don't see anything. Okay, I've seen a couple of outliers, which were things which are called IPAs, which are like 8, 9 or 10% ABV, but they're real outliers. They're a couple of beers, and the vast majority of over 7% ABV. When it kicks off, Hodgson, the general story is true. Hodgson did have a pretty much complete monopoly. He annoyed people in the trade, and so other breweries moved in, and they basically took over from him. So you see that Hodgson has a virtual monopoly on the original trade, and then Bass and Allsop move in because people are pissed off with Hodgson, and they eventually take over most of the trade. But it wasn't a huge amount of beer. If you're looking about this 20,000 barrels of stuff, this was really small beer for the British breweries at the time. If you're looking at the big London breweries in the 1840s, they were brewing 500,000 or 600,000 barrels a year. So 20,000 barrels isn't a huge amount of beer. It's not a really big deal. You look at the original characteristics, they wanted it really pale. That's why they brewed it from the best. That's why the Burton breweries mostly had their own maltings, because they wanted to have the beer really pale. So they wanted to have their own malt that they used. They'd brew it in a certain way to keep the color really pale. So they're really keen on having a really pale color. It's hard to come across exactly what that color was. I think way paler than modern English bitter, and not as pale as lager, but not that much darker. Wasn't particularly strong, and it was always brewed as a stock ale, which meant that it was matured for a long time before it ever got on a boat or went anywhere. So it was a beer that was going to be aged for at least 6 months and probably a lot longer. And one of the big things about preserving the beer wasn't high alcohol, it was the high degree of attenuation. So the high degree of attenuation meant that the beer had, when it was in the ship, it had nothing for anything nasty to eat on. And that's one of the things they seem to have been very deliberate about doing, fermenting the beer all the way out and making it really flat before they put it on the boats. So it's true, hops are involved, but it wasn't alcohol. Attenuation was more important. The whole thing about water, you see the thing originally, you have some of the London breweries like Truman's who buy a brewery in Burton just to brew pale ales because the water's right there. But you see this really, and so this is a big thing like in the 1860s, 1870s, before people work out what water chemistry was. And then when they do, people generally just treat the water and don't go to the places where the water's right. They're very keen on keeping the colour of pale ale really pale, which, given the name was pale ale, it's not so weird. And so they did various things in the brewing process. So they didn't do a long boil. They didn't do a boil in a closed copper like they did in London with their porters, where they wanted to get some colour from the boiling process. They're very keen to keep the colour very light. And then you see later on, when they're allowed other ingredients, that they're using loads of sugar and they're using things like rice or flake maize, not because it was cheaper, but because they want to keep the colour and the body of the beer very light, because that's what people expect from a pale ale. Unions are not fermenting vessels. Unions are cleansing vessels. If you look at the old days in British brewing, you had two stages of fermentation. You have primary fermentation, which you do in rounds or squares, open top vessels. And then you have the second phase, which is the one where you get all the yeast out, which is called cleansing. And you do it in various different ways. And Burton unions, they were basically a mechanized system of the one they'd used in London, which was called pontos, where you have these big barrels, you have them leaned over, and the yeast would come off the top, and then they take it off by hand and bug around with it like that. And unions were basically a mechanized system of doing that. So all they're on about is getting the yeast out of the beer. They are not about fermentation. It's a yeast removal system. Loads of breweries had them. Everyone who was brewing pale ales installed them. You had loads in Scotland. You had them all over the country. What the big problem with Burton unions was, they were virtually impossible to keep sanitary and to keep clean. And that's why most breweries did away with them, because there was so much, because you've got all this wood, just a nightmare. This is the first recipe I came across in brewing records for an IPA. My guess is it's from Coombe, but I have no actual idea who it came from. It could have been from anyone, but I think it was from Coombe. But you see, it's got it doesn't have a huge gravity. It's not a particularly strong beer, at least not for early 19th century standards, when beers tended to be, standard mild ale would have been this strong. Yeah, IPA in India, it's always a good one. People think everyone drank IPA in India. It's not true at all. In fact, way more porter was exported to India. And in fact, porter was the drink of preference of ordinary soldiers in the army. It's only the posh people who got to drink IPA. And in fact, if you look at all these things from the East India Company, generally they're asking for about twice as much porter as they are IPA. So my guess would be at least double amount of porter got exported to India as IPA, because that's just what the ordinary soldiers who were over there drank. And during the Indian Mutiny, but during that period in the 1850s, when a lot more British troops were sent over to India, you see the amount of export India porter being brewed in London suddenly really shoots up, because obviously they were sending beer out to serve all these troops, all these extra British troops. And it shows you that's what the ordinary soldiers were drinking. Trying to stop them drinking rum, because they all died if they drank rum and arak. There's various reports from British Army doctors saying make them drink porter because otherwise they don't die as quickly. So when I was saying about how a lot of the beer that got exported to India wasn't particularly strong, this is the first set of actual real numbers that I have about IPA, and especially IPA being exported to India. And you see that some of it has got gravities in the low 1050. So it's not particularly strong beer, but what they all have in common is a really high degree of attenuation. And you have to remember that at this point in the UK, most beer would have been at most 75% attenuated. So stuff that's 90%, that's incredibly highly attenuated. So these are beers which are all actually exported to India, which is what makes it interesting. And you see that they average out not really that strong, quite high in ABV, but that's because they're very highly attenuated. In terms of OG, not that high. You look at mild, a London mild of this period would have been probably higher OG than 1060, probably about 1065, so higher than. It's really interesting when it comes to IPA being sold in the UK. The story was that there was a shipwreck no one had evidence for, and then Martin Cornell actually managed to track it down because the date had been wrong. But what it more seems to be like is that it was people returning from India, because I've read a few reports about people who came back from India, and when they were going to posh dinner parties, what they wanted to drink was IPA, not wine, because that's what they got used to over in the colonies. So I think that's partly what it was. But even when they were selling it in the UK, it was still a stock beer, and it was still aged for a really long period of time. These are another set of IPAs. These were sold in the UK. And honestly, something that's got a gravity of 1044.7, that is like a table beer. That's like the stuff you give the kids in the 1840s. That's a really low gravity. And these gravities are way below the gravities of the weakest mild ales that you'd be having. The original IPAs, they were all stock ales. They weren't aged the same way that Porter and Stout was, where Porter and Stout, that would always be put into big vats for aging. IPA always seems to have been aged in trade casks, you actually send out into the trade. So nothing bigger than hogsheads. And then you get later on, they start doing like semi-stock versions, but the original classic pale ales were all stock ales that were aged for stupid lengths of time before being sold. These are the ages that you get for aging different beers. And so you can see that AK, which is one of my many obsessions as a beer, light pale ale, that only had a couple of weeks. So basically down to the pub cellar and sold. Yeah, Bass Pale Ale, it was all they only ever called pale ale. The way that they aged that was completely crazy. They just stuck it out in the brewery yard in stacks, put a few bits of straw over it maybe, left it for 9 to 12 months, and then put it on the ship to India. But the thing they said was that when a beer had gone through this sort of tough love, that it was incredibly stable and could put up with anything basically. So you can see why they were doing it, but it seems totally crazy to me. The domestic versions of these strong pale ales, they were still aged for a long time, not quite as long, but still a long time, and completely different to modern IPA. And here's a sign of some really crazily highly attenuated versions of Bass. Some that are virtually completely fermented out. And this seems to be pretty typical of the late 19th century IPAs, that they were extremely highly attenuated. Scottish IPA. This may be something that people may not associate Scotland with IPA, but in fact Scottish brewers were really into the IPA trade, partly because they were very big exporters of beer. And so obviously they were going to start brewing the beer that people wanted in export markets. It's also why Scottish brewers got into the lager trade very early because they're very heavily into exports. And so you see a lot of IPA being brewed in Edinburgh and exported in really large amounts to all over the world, and was probably as important as Burton, Edinburgh and Alloa. And originally they hopped them like crazy, just like the Burton ones. But especially for the domestic market, as time goes on, they really drop the hopping rates. I assume because Scottish people like their beer not quite as bitter. When you see IPA coming on in the 20th century, then you see that generally the hopping rates are going down. Everyone stops brewing it as a stock ale pretty much, apart from in Burton, where you have a completely different sort of pale ale existing. So they're still brewing things in Burton that are pretty much like the original IPAs. So stuff that's over 1060, mostly for the export trade, but they still seem to be selling some of it in the UK. The draft version of Vast, that goes down to about 5.5% ABV. So still by modern standards, something quite strong, but it's all starting to change. And you have the whole pale ale and IPA thing getting completely mixed up, because you have brewers like Whitbread, where the first pale ale they brewed was called PA. It was a beer of like over 6%. When they started brewing a beer called IPA, it was weaker. It's quite often, whereas anyone nowadays in the US would think IPA is always going to be stronger than a brewery's pale ale, whereas that wasn't necessarily the case back in Britain. And so particularly in London, you have with Whitbread and Barclay Perkins, where their IPA is a lot weaker than their pale ale, and it's just what the market expected. And so you see that in the 20th century in London, IPA becomes something quite different. This is an example of now I would say that this beer, this is one of the beers, hopefully you're drinking. This is one of the beers that, for the period 1902, a beer of just under 1050, that was actually not particularly high gravity. Their mild would have been stronger at this point. So that I think their mild at this point was about 1055. So this is not a strong beer, but it is quite heavily hopped. And so it's more heavily hopped than the pale ale was. So it's a strange sort of thing. So the heavy hopping thing seems to live on in Whitbread IPA, even though it's not that strong a beer. I hope I'm confusing everyone here with what the hell IPA is, because I'm confused. I don't really know what it was either. And so you see these sorts of low gravity IPAs, and it's really typical in London in between the wars that IPA seems to become a quite hoppy but fairly low gravity bottled beer. And you've still got some beers like that today. So Harvey's still brew an IPA that's like that. Harvey's is, well, obviously the best brewery in the world anyway, but because they're crazily old fashioned. But they still brew a beer called IPA that's about 1030 but quite heavily hopped. And what you find happens in Britain, that these sort of IPA go into this type of beer called light ale, which is basically extinct now in the UK, or almost, which is a really, a 3% bottled pale ale that's not very interesting, basically. It might explain why it doesn't really exist anymore. But it used to be a huge thing. And this is where these low gravity IPAs end up. They end up being like light ale, this thing it's like the current Harvey's version of IPA is, I think, 3%, probably not even any more than that. I think it's only 3%. But it's this tradition of IPA, which is a completely different one from what Americans think of as IPA. This is a recipe for Whitbread IPA from just at the end of World War I. So, yeah, pretty weak, but actually fairly bitter as well. So Whitbread seem to have stuck with this, that they really hopped their IPA quite heavily, even when it was a really weedy beer. And they hopped it more heavily than they did their standard pale ale, even though the pale ale was stronger, which is, probably confuses everyone. So you see, after World War II, you still had a couple of beers which were pretty much like original IPA. So in particular, White Shield and Vast Red Triangle, which in the 50s, like 6% plus beers. So basically pretty much like the classic IPAs. I must say, Worthington White Shield was a wonderful beer. It used to be one of the few beers that was still bottle conditioned in Britain, and you could get it fairly widely. It was wonderful, especially if you mixed it with draft bass, which is what I used to do. So if you mixed it with draft bass, you'd end up with something about 5.5%, 6% ABV in a pint. So lots of fun. But it was, I think it still exists, Worthington White Shield, not really in the form it used to be. It's a wonderful label as well. And yeah, one of the classic beers when I was younger. So here's some examples of these sort of things. Blue Triangle, that's the non-bottle conditioned version of Bass Red Triangle. But you'll see just like crazy rates of attenuation on some of these. Obviously, some of these beers that we're still brewing to be sold in Belgium. So there's a big trade in British Pale Ale and Stout and Scotch Ale in Belgium. And yeah, quite a few breweries in Britain were either brewing beers especially for the Belgian market or tweaking their beers that they normally brewed for the Belgian market. And this is Boddington's IP. So Boddington's Bitter, as people would know it. Whether or not this was an IPA, I don't know. But they still called it IP and inside the brew house. And to me, that says IPA. So I'm going to take that as an IPA. Yeah, really light, very highly attenuated, a simple beer. I quite liked Boddington, and it tasted a lot bitterer than the 26 IBUs, I would say, mostly because it was very highly attenuated. So because there was very little residual sugar left in it, the bitterness that was in there really struck you. So a lot of people would say, oh, they remember Boddington Bitter being a very bitter beer. And when I looked at all the sort of recipes, I was looking, it doesn't come out as that bitter a beer, even though I remember it as being more bitter than that. And I think it's purely because it was very highly attenuated. And so the bitterness was more obvious because there wasn't anything else getting in the way of the bitter flavour. That's been done otherwise, other than trying to encourage you to buy some of my books, which are really excellent, have lots of recipes in and lots of stuff with me talking about crap, basically.
Ron is great, and I so enjoy his lectures. I've tasted several historically accurate IPAs, and I was so impressed with how well they maintain their great flavor despite their exposure to lengthy voyages, temperature extremes, and constant motion. It is a style truly deserving of global status. Now, please consider giving this video a like and keep us on the air through Patreon support. And then I want to hear your takeaway in the comments below.